Brinkley, settle down.
"6 a.m., March 8, 1965. U.S. Navy Amphibious Task Force 76 laid at anchor off Da Nang, the main harbor in the Republic of South Vietnam. On board the swaying ships were the men of the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines. Lined up along the railings, the young leathernecks waited for orders to go over the side and make their way ashore. After what seemed like endless hours to the impatient Marines, the order was given to land. Led by Brigadier General Frederick Karch, over the side they went and down the cargo nets hanging along the hulls of the transport ships. A 2nd Brigade of Marines flew for the air base in the city by helicopter. The landings went essentially unopposed. In fact, General Karch was embarrassed to be greeted by Vietnamese flower maidens who adorned his sweaty neck with tropical flowers.
We were expecting to see something on the beachhead, but when we got there, we never would have believed. Here comes all these Vietnamese children and that with flowers for welcoming us there. We're here to save them, and showed their appreciation. They brought us flowers.
At first glance, Vietnam might have seemed like a good old-fashioned U.S. Marine drop-in. Brisk assaults into the jungles, shoot a little, bleed a little, and home for dinner. But in Vietnam, dinner would be late. The French army had been in Indochina since the middle of the 19th century. Their grip on the colony began to loosen with the fall of France to Nazi Germany in 1940. Early in 1940, Ho Chi Minh returned from Paris to Vietnam to become the leading figure in the Indochinese Communist Party and its military arm, the Viet Minh. This military force was formed to fight the French in Southeast Asia, but soon was confronted by another, more dangerous foe. On August 30th, 1940, the Matsuoka-Henry Pact was signed by the puppet Vichy government and the Empire of Japan. This pact permitted the Japanese to station troops in French Indochina. The French colonial administration now was merely window dressing for the Japanese army. To Ho Chi Minh, it made no difference as to who the occupying army was. They were still forcing their rule upon his people. With the help of arms and training from the U.S., he invited all the region's revolutionary forces to unite under his command. Far away from the jungle battles, a death blow was struck against the Japanese Empire that brought the war to an end. On September 3, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, Japan surrendered to the Allies. But even before the ink was dry on the surrender document, the groundwork for a new conflict was being laid in Indochina. As the Japanese troops in Vietnam were laying down their arms, Ho Chi Minh was taking advantage of the power vacuum left by the defeated Imperial Army.
We Americans tend to think of it beginning in 1965 when we arrived there, but in fact that war begins September 2nd, 1945, when Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh, using words from the American Declaration of Independence, ironically, I think, declare independence from France.
Ho proclaimed himself to be the only political authority for the nation, and that the colony was now the Free Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the French had other ideas. In Paris, General Charles de Gaulle, anxious to restore French sovereignty in Indochina, decided to send a 70,000-man expeditionary force to regain control of the Asian colony.
France, which is not about to concede independence easily or gracefully, but is determined to hold on to its empire in Indochina in some form. The French come back in with some help from the British. By November 1946, Ho's Viet Minh and the French are engaged in a war that would last until 1954 and would constitute sort of the first phase of 30 years of wars in Vietnam.
For 8 years, France attempted to subdue the stubborn coalition of communist guerrillas and Vietnamese nationalists.
The United States fears that if it pushes France too hard to grant independence, one, it could cause the collapse of the French government and France tilting to the left in Europe. And Western Europe is the main concern between 1945 and 1950. That's where the focus of our policy is. France is a key to that policy, and if France were to shift to the left or even go neutralist, then that would shift the balance against us in Europe. So there's a real reluctance to push the French too hard. The French realize that and engage in what some U.S. officials flatly admitted was blackmail.
In total, nearly 30,000 legionnaires were deployed. They were expected to easily quash the Asian rebel. The men's loyalty is to each other and to the officers for whom they marched or die. The Legion's climactic battle of Southeast Asia was at Dien Bien Phu. In November of 1953, France foolishly deployed the majority of its forces in a vast basin totally surrounded by jungle-clad hills held by the enemy Viet Minh.
The idea being to send significant numbers of troops up into Dien Bien Phu, a relative isolated area near the Laotian border, northwest Vietnam, and try to lure the Viet Minh into attacking them and then use their superior firepower to defeat the Viet Minh army, presumably the idea that this would give them a favorable position in the peace negotiations coming up at Geneva.
All winter, undetected by French commanders, the enemy moved into position. The Viet Minh covered the hills with hundreds of cannons and tons of ordnance, carried on their backs up the steep slopes, placing the French base under constant fire.
The climactic struggle for Dien Bien Phu enters its second month with airborne reinforcements shuttled to the beleaguered garrison, where paratroopers drop to a fate that remains in the balance. The picked contingent hits the ground and goes into action immediately with machine gun and mortar fire. Operation Castor takes the pressure off the original defenders of the garrison, whose name has become military legend. Throwing air superiority into the struggle, all possible cover is provided before monsoon's ground plains. Outnumbered 4-1, they repulse attacks. Both sides fight to the last ditch for Dien Bien Phu.
The men fought until there was no more ammunition, no more bodies to absorb the relentless shrapnel raining from the skies above. On May 8, 1945, the fortress fell.
Literally hours before the meeting in Geneva shifts to the issue of the war in Vietnam, and of course it has a critical effect on those negotiations.
8,000 legionnaires were dead. Back in the U.S., the devil dogs could see the handwriting on the wall.
We were ready to go into Dien Bien Phu. The 3rd Marine Division was on alert to go into Dien Bien Phu. That's the first time I heard of Vietnam.
The fall of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of the French War and the beginning of America's longest conflict. Once again, The Marines would be in the vanguard of the fight. After the war, the Geneva Accord was signed, and Indochina was split into two neighboring nations at the 17th parallel. To the north of the 17th parallel, the communist nation of North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. To the south was South Vietnam.
After World War II in the late 40s, the United States initiates a policy of containment of Soviet expansion, communist expansion as early as 1947-48. The Viet Minh is linked with the Soviet Union. There are no direct ties at this time, but the feeling is that because of Ho Chi Minh's experience or the time he spent in the 20s and 30s with the Communist International, it's pretty clear what direction he's heading.
As North Vietnamese attacks against the South intensified, the United States' involvement in the war increased.
Neither the Soviet Union or China at this point are particularly excited about a war in Vietnam. The United States tries to restrain Diem from oppression of the rural masses in South Vietnam. It's only when the Vietnamese themselves raise the war to a new level that the outside powers begin to escalate themselves.
President Eisenhower laid down the gauntlet in the face of a communist challenge, but it was the president from a new generation who was to pick it up with dire consequences. In 1961, under the Kennedy administration, the United States answered the call for help from the South Vietnamese and began increasing its military aid with hardware and advisors.
The first major step on our part in that way comes in late 1961 when John Kennedy, rejecting proposals to send combat troops in this early, decides to step up U.S. aid and the size of the U.S. advisory team in South Vietnam. So that's our first big step of escalation. Soviet Union and China, really, their aid comes later.
In South Vietnam, the United States began a program to help the villagers in the north and along the Delta protect themselves from the VC and NLF.
There was an entire program, strategic village program, that was put into place in the early 1960s throughout Vietnam. However, it did fail.
The ultimate goal, according to the Kennedy administration at this time, was to install a functional army in South Vietnam, and once done, send American military advisors back home.
There were 300-400 advisors there before Kennedy takes office. What he does is to significantly increase the number to the point that it's over 16,000 by the time he's assassinated in 1963.
These advisors not only trained the ARVN troops, but they also trained local villagers.
The strategic village concept was a defended village that had integrated support programs, medical, agricultural, all sorts of programs to assist the Vietnamese people for increasing their education, for adding all sorts of conveniences to their lives without being interfered with by the communists.
The best and brightest of the United States military tried to turn rice farmers into soldiers. The Strategic Village program showed some initial signs of success, but the Viet Cong began to apply more aggressive tactics toward ARVN forces and the growing U.S. installations in South Vietnam.
In 1962 and 1963, the civilian irregular defense groups, primarily in the high plateau region of northern part of South Vietnam, worked out quite well. And a tremendous amount of progress was made against communist forces in cutting down their ability to collect rice taxes, cutting down their ability to recruit, and being hounded in the jungles. Well, that started to change when the North Vietnamese changed their strategy. And that was that rather than small company-sized forces operating against the Americans and South Vietnamese, they started operating in battalion-size units, importing ever more recruits and trainees through Laos and Cambodia to get to South Vietnam.
The Viet Cong's massive military support from the NVA forces in the north, as well as from China, made the VC a dangerous adversary. In short order, the United States realized that the pacification programs in Vietnam were not going according to plan.
You have to make a decision that you're going to fight inside South Vietnam, and therefore it's a counterinsurgency. The problem is it allows North Vietnam to send whatever support they can send and make the insurgency grow much larger than you would have seen an insurgency grow in, say, Malaya, which was their key model, the British in Malaya in the late 40s and 50s.
What they had going, one, many of them had been involved in a war against France, so they had experience. They knew what mobilizing people in the countryside was all about. They used a combination of positive appeals through such things as land reform, which was crucial in a rural society like South Vietnam, along with terror. I mean, they were very skillful at combining these two things to win peasants over to their side.
Sending in conventional United States troops became an increasingly serious consideration.
When it is clear to American planners that the war in Vietnam, the insurgency in Vietnam, backed by Hanoi, is becoming a large problem which directly threatens the survival of the Saigon government, I think that the Kennedy emphasis on special forces just gets swept aside.
When JFK's motorcade turned onto Dealey Plaza, the hopes and dreams of a generation rode with him. As an assassin's bullet tore through Kennedy's body, both were destroyed. Many of the children that stood by and watched as their mothers and fathers wept would in only a few years' time be fighting in America's longest war in history. With Kennedy's death, the burden of Vietnam fell upon Lyndon Johnson's shoulders.
Letting Saigon go down the tubes is not an option. Now, a lot of people, of course, have since argued that maybe that should have been an option, but that's really irrelevant at the time, because given the context of the Cold War, there's no American political group, Democrat, Republican, or whoever, who's going to be the next guy to lose China, which is what Truman had done in 49. Johnson's not going to be the man who loses Vietnam. So the consideration of getting out of Vietnam is out the window. So American main force troops are really the only thing Johnson could do, and that's the route he chose.
With a new administration in the White House, events in Vietnam became dire. Communist China now began to increase arms support to the north in order to escalate the damage to South Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson had to decide if he should raise the ante in Vietnam or fold his hand.
His phone conversations are fascinating because they reveal, on the one hand, that he did not want to fail in Vietnam. He did not want the stigma attached to himself of, as he and others put it, being the first American president to lose a war. On the other hand, I think he, like Kennedy, had grave reservations about the possibilities of success there. You can hear him in some of these phone conversations ruminating aloud with uncanny prescience about, we may have 500,000 troops out there bogged down, support's going to collapse at home. He has a pretty good understanding of, in fact, what happens, but he is simply unwilling to tolerate the idea of failure for the United States or failure for himself. In 64-65, he doesn't want to give up or give in because he's afraid it will damage his own personal prestige and thereby affect his Great Society programs, which are always uppermost in his mind. He refers to the Great Society as the woman I really love, and the war is that bitch of a war out there on the other side of the world.
Though they carried with them superior firepower provided by the United States, the ARVN forces were continually outnumbered and defeated by the Viet Cong.
They're still fairly poorly armed, but they're big groups of them. So it is what the communists consider stage 3 warfare, which is the main force war, big groups of insurgents getting together to attack government installations or ambush government troops. In other words, they are choosing the field of battle as opposed to just fading away whenever the government shows up.
Later on, in 1964, they went from battalions to regiments, so they could knock off an entire South Vietnamese battalion with some ease. It was a cat and mouse game all during the war, and the North Vietnamese knew when to escalate because they knew when they were losing.
During his campaign for president in 1964, Johnson repeatedly announced he would not send American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing. Soon, events in Vietnam made this an empty promise.
By late 64, early 65, that the United States does not do something drastic, then there will be a North Vietnamese NLF military victory, or the South Vietnamese government will simply collapse. And so the United States intervenes with the idea that the injection of a major U.S. presence will persuade the North Vietnamese and NLF to come to some sort of agreement.
The decision basically comes down, American main force troops, or are we able to train the South Vietnamese army in a short amount of time to stand on its own? And the answer by the end of 1964 is, we have to send American troops in.
Then, in August 1964, after the alleged attacks at the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnamese vessels, American military involvement in Vietnam changed completely. American boys were indeed going to be sent to fight another war in Asia. The incident was an attack on an American destroyer, the Maddox, by North Vietnamese PT boats. The alleged attack 2 days later on the Turner Joy provoked the U.S. Congress to give President Johnson a free hand in running the war. Johnson quickly ordered airstrikes against select locations in the north. The communists wasted no time in striking back after the initial American air attacks. Viet Cong sappers hit the U.S. Air Force base at Bien Phu. 4 Americans died and 5 U.S. planes were destroyed. On February 10th, Viet Cong attacked another U.S. Army barracks. 23 were killed, 22 wounded. 2 days later, February 12th, Operation Flaming Dart II began. Naval warplanes took off from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, and from Da Nang Ground Air Base, B-57s took to the skies. The commander of Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, or MACV, was U.S. General William C. Westmoreland. MACV was the overseer of all military activity in Vietnam. Westmoreland was deeply concerned about the safety of the Da Nang Air Force Base and the American planes based there. Westmoreland requested 2 battalions of Marines be deployed to guard the Da Nang complex. On March 1, 1965, that request was approved. The devil dogs were unleashed in Vietnam.